Georgia, 1840. In the heart of cotton country, a woman of wealth and charm ruled a sprawling plantation. But behind her lace curtains lay a secret no ledger ever dared record. Hidden journals whispered of her strange rituals with the enslaved men under her control. Some were sold the very next morning, their eyes hollow, their voices broken. The neighbors, silent. The evidence, conveniently burned, and yet, scraps of testimony remain, enough to suggest a story far darker than polite society would ever admit. If you have the courage to keep listening, you may wish you hadn't. This isn't just another tale of the South's brutality. This is a story about power, the kind of power that turns intimacy into a weapon and reputation into a shield. A mistress who carried herself as a lady of refinement yet used her station to indulge desires unspoken, unspeakable. What was dismissed as eccentricity may, in truth, have been exploitation on a scale more disturbing than any whip or chain. Do you have the courage to face what really happened in the shadows of antebellum Georgia? Subscribe, leave a comment with where you're watching from, and step into the investigation with us. Because once you see the plantation through this lens, you'll never look at its silent walls the same way again. I want you to picture this. Georgia, the year 1840. The air is heavy with humidity, thick with the scent of tobacco smoke and cotton fields stretching past the horizon. The plantation house itself, painted pristine white, gleams like a pearl on a hill, but its beauty is an illusion. Beneath its polished floors and grand chandeliers lies a system designed to conceal cruelty. This was an era when whispers traveled faster than truth, when appearances mattered more than conscience. The plantation mistress, outwardly genteel, moved with the grace of Southern refinement, entertaining guests with silver trays and sweet tea, yet always watching, always calculating. The enslaved population, men, women, and children, lived just beyond the manicured gardens, in cabins where heat, hunger, and silence pressed down like a second skin. At first glance, it was just another prosperous estate in Georgia. But if you lean in closer, you'll hear the unsettling undercurrent, hushed voices of those who claimed that the lady of the house held a fascination for the very men society called property. That fascination, carefully hidden from polite conversation, would prove far more disturbing than the lash, and those who dared to question, they vanished into silence. Now, you have to understand, this is not the story of just one plantation. It is the story of what happens when unchecked power and social immunity collide in the darkest corners of history. Let's be real, villains rarely wear the mask we expect. The woman at the center of this story was not a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. She was celebrated. She attended church in her best gown, presided over dinner parties, and sent polite notes of condolence when neighbors suffered losses. To the outside world, she was refined, educated, and benevolent. But behind closed doors, she wielded a different power, one of manipulation, desire, and control. Her husband, absent, often traveling on business, leaving her with near total authority over the household. That absence became her shield. Local men trusted her, local women envied her, and the enslaved feared her. She blurred the line between mistress and predator, cloaking her actions in the respectability afforded by her wealth. And what made her most dangerous was that she never needed to lift a whip. Her authority rested in unspoken threats, the power to sell, to separate, to erase lives with a signature in the ledger. Imagine being a young man in her grasp, knowing that refusal was impossible, knowing that compliance sealed your fate just as surely. She was, in every way, a figure who thrived on the mask of Southern gentility. The more she smiled in public, the more sinister the truth she concealed became. Now, you have to understand, a secret like this doesn't survive without a carefully constructed cover. To her neighbors, the frequent turnover of enslaved men on her estate was easily explained. She would claim financial necessity, the fluctuations of crop yields, the debts her absent husband supposedly incurred. No one questioned it because the story was believable. After all, plantations were businesses, and slaves were considered commodities, sold, traded, or leveraged when convenient. Her pattern of selling men shortly after acquiring them raised no alarm in her circle. She even wove sympathy into her explanations, sighing about the misfortunes of cotton prices, hinting at her own vulnerability, while carefully hiding the truth of her appetite. And society, with its ironclad refusal to pierce the veil of white Southern womanhood, protected her. Neighbors dismissed rumors as slander. Church leaders looked the other way, unwilling to tarnish the image of one of their own. Even those who suspected something darker kept silent, for to challenge a lady of such standing was unthinkable. That's the terrifying brilliance of her scheme. The lie was simple, plausible, and wrapped in respectability. The deeper truth, that her influence stretched into the most intimate parts of enslaved men's lives, was never spoken above a whisper. But here's where the story gets truly chilling. She didn't operate alone. The infrastructure of slavery itself enabled her. Overseers and household staff, whether willingly complicit or trapped by circumstance, became silent enablers. A locked chamber in the big house, always shuttered when visitors arrived, became the center of her secret domain. She used her control over every aspect of plantation life, clothing, food, punishment, and sale, to ensure obedience. The men targeted had no recourse, no ally, no hope of refusing her demands. Every ledger entry, every bill of sale, every staged necessity to sell a man after she had finished with him was part of a system designed not just for profit, but for concealment. This wasn't spontaneous indulgence. It was calculated. She created cycles: acquisition, exploitation, disposal, and the wider community, benefiting from her transactions, asked no questions. To them, money changed hands, crops were harvested, and society's order remained intact. But for those trapped within her reach, the nightmare was endless. The plantation itself became a stage, polished in public, horrifying in private. And like all well-designed systems of control, it relied not on open violence, but on silence and inevitability. That silence still echoes if you listen closely enough. Of course, people notice patterns, even in communities built on denial. Why so many young men came and went from her estate raised murmurs in hushed tones. But she always had explanations ready, and they sounded reasonable. She blamed the market, claiming certain men fetched better prices in New Orleans. She spoke of her husband's business misfortunes, spinning tales of debts that required sudden liquidations. Sometimes, she even cloaked her choices in a twisted veil of charity, insisting she was placing them with families who would treat them better. The irony was sickening, but the audience she spoke to wanted to believe her. It was easier to accept her lies than confront the truth, that a woman of refinement might be capable of such grotesque abuse. And when confronted directly, she wielded outrage like a weapon, turning suspicion back on the accuser. "How dare you imply such a thing about a lady of my standing?" she would snap. And in a society built on protecting white womanhood, the defense was ironclad. Rumors died, but the pattern continued. The official explanations were more than alibis. They were shields, carefully forged from the biases and blind spots of her community. Every predator has someone who looks the other way, and she was no exception. In her case, it was the overseer, a man whose loyalty was secured not by affection, but by fear and profit. He managed the transactions, recorded the sales, and ensured the men were moved quickly once their usefulness had ended. Whether he suspected the truth or knew it outright, his silence was purchased through privilege. He drank well, dressed better than most of his class, and lived under her protection. He became her gatekeeper, ensuring that anyone who might stumble too close to her secret was turned away or threatened into quiet. Some accounts suggest he occasionally blackmailed her, holding scraps of knowledge as leverage, but in the end, he never exposed her. Why? Because the system enriched him too. His complicity ensured the cycle continued, his role forever etched into the dark machinery of her crimes. Now you have to understand, the men she targeted weren't nameless shadows. They were human beings, each with a history, a voice, and dreams brutally truncated. Some were young and newly purchased, disoriented by their arrival on unfamiliar land. Others were seasoned workers, hardened by years in bondage, yet caught off guard by her particular brand of power. She chose them deliberately, the strongest, the most resilient, the ones whose dignity hadn't yet been broken. And that made their fall all the more devastating. Neighbors described them as fine stock, reducing their worth to physicality. But what was erased was their humanity. For them, every choice was stolen, every refusal punished by exile through sale. Families were torn apart not just for profit, but as collateral damage in her private rituals. And when they disappeared from the plantation, their absence was noted only in ledgers, their voices silenced forever. But secrets this dark can't stay hidden forever. There was eventually a witness, and not one she had planned for. A young girl, herself enslaved, tasked with cleaning the main house, stumbled into the wrong room at the wrong time. What she saw was never recorded in detail, but her terror spoke volumes. For days afterward, she refused to speak, trembling whenever summoned to the big house. Word of her fear spread among the quarters, a silent acknowledgement that something unspeakable was happening behind closed doors. Yet, as quickly as she appeared, the witness was gone, sold to another plantation hundreds of miles away. Was it coincidence, or was it a calculated move to erase the one set of eyes that had seen too much? The timing suggests the latter. Her disappearance became a chilling reminder. On that estate, truth was as fragile as paper, easily destroyed with a signature. Imagine for a moment the weight this girl carried. Torn from the only community she knew, isolated in a new plantation, she bore scars not of the lash, but of memory. Whispers followed her, fragments of what she might have seen, but she never spoke openly again. Trauma silenced her, and society buried her truth beneath layers of denial. The official story claimed she had been sold due to ill temper. It was easier to brand her as difficult than to confront the reality she had stumbled upon. Her suffering became a cautionary tale. For the enslaved, knowing too much was as dangerous as rebellion. For the mistress, her removal reinforced the illusion of control. The denial was total, both inside and outside the plantation. Those who guessed at the truth convinced themselves it was exaggeration or slander or the fevered invention of people desperate to explain the unexplainable. And so the cycle continued. Eventually, rumors spread far enough to reach ears outside her carefully curated circle. An official inquiry was whispered about, a discreet visit by a county magistrate, cloaked as a routine check on trade records. He asked questions, flipped through ledgers, and left with reassurances. Why? Because every piece of evidence had been scrubbed clean. The overseer had falsified dates and transactions, ensuring that no suspicious patterns were traceable. When pressed, the lady herself played her role with perfection, indignantly insisting she was the target of gossip meant to discredit her absent husband. The magistrate left convinced, or perhaps willfully blind, and the matter was closed before it truly began. That's how conspiracies thrive, not in the shadows, but in plain sight, protected by respectability and a community unwilling to tarnish its own. But the human body does not lie. Survivors carried their suffering in posture, in silence, in the haunted look of men who had endured something that stripped them beyond chains. Other enslaved people noticed the change. Some described men who returned from the big house distant, broken, or volatile. Their spirits diminished in ways that no whip could explain. They became living evidence of a crime no one dared name. And when they were sold, their emptiness traveled with them, a silent testimony that whispered across miles. Records tell us nothing of their inner worlds, but the fragments we do have, oral histories, rare journals, hint at a trauma passed down through memory, embedded in generations. That was her most chilling legacy. She altered people not only physically, but in ways that reverberated long after her plantation ceased to exist. This is where the story turns chilling in a different way. Hidden among the plantation's surviving papers are notes, not personal diaries, but ledger-like accounts that reveal an almost methodical process. Ages, physical descriptions, purchase dates, sale dates, all meticulously recorded. Cross-referenced with testimonies, these notes suggest she approached her abuses with calculation, as though conducting experiments of power. She categorized men not just as property, but as subjects in her own ritual of domination. The cold precision of it is what unsettles most. This wasn't random cruelty. It was structured, systematic. And in that methodology lies the true horror. She had turned exploitation into something resembling a science. But every story like this needs a counterforce, a voice of resistance. Enter a man whose name history has nearly forgotten, a traveling abolitionist, arriving in Georgia under the guise of a merchant. He was not flawless. Pride and recklessness often placed him in danger, but he carried with him a relentless hunger for truth and a personal stake that made this mission unavoidable. His own brother had vanished years before, sold south after a brief stop at this very plantation. Coincidence? He didn't think so. His suspicion drove him to investigate, to peel back the layers of respectability that shielded the mistress. He listened to whispers, gathered scraps of testimony, and pieced together a picture darker than even he imagined. In him, the story gains momentum, for he was willing to risk everything to expose what others buried in silence. Disguised as a traitor, he gained entry to her world. Polite conversation over dinner, tours of the estate, ledgers carefully shown as if transparency proved innocence. He observed it all with keen eyes. He noticed the locked chamber upstairs, the too frequent turnover of enslaved men, the fear etched into their faces when her name was spoken. Slowly, he built trust with those willing to whisper in the shadows. A stable boy hinted at men who disappeared. A field hand mentioned the girl who had been sold away in terror. Piece by piece, he assembled a puzzle that pointed toward something monstrous. But the deeper he dug, the greater the danger. The overseer watched him closely, and the lady herself, with her unnerving composure, seemed to sense that he was not who he claimed to be. What he uncovered would test not only his courage, but his sanity. Because sometimes the truth doesn't just haunt you, it hunts you. Now I need to ask you something directly. Can you handle what comes next? Because from this point forward, the story descends into territory most historians refuse to tread. Up until now, we've been piecing together whispers, ledgers, and rumors. But the evidence that our hero uncovered, and the fate he barely escaped, takes this tale from unsettling to downright terrifying. You've been listening as an investigator, as a seeker of truth. But here's the thing, the truth doesn't care if you're ready for it. It strikes, sharp and merciless. This is where the story gets truly chilling. Because the deeper we go, the more we realize that this plantation was not just a house of labor, but a chamber of secrets. Secrets preserved not in dusty records, but in the lives it shattered. So I'll ask you again, as I always do, are you willing to keep following me down this road? If so, lean closer. Because the next discovery nearly cost a man his life. It happened on a night thick with silence, when the air pressed heavy against the walls and the cicadas seemed to fall quiet, as if nature itself held its breath. Our hero had been granted a guest room in the big house under the pretense of business, but he could not sleep. He had watched the mistress glide through the halls with her practiced smile, had seen the overseer's suspicious glances, and had felt the weight of unspoken terror in the eyes of the enslaved men. Something gnawed at him, telling him that proof, real proof, was near. And so, when the house settled into slumber, he slipped into the corridor with only a candle and his resolve. At first, there was nothing unusual. Framed portraits of stern ancestors, polished silver glinting in the shadows. But then, at the end of a hallway few dared to enter, he noticed the door. Thick wood, iron-banded, and locked. A chamber hidden in plain sight. He pressed his ear against it. Nothing. No sound, only the cold stillness of a room determined to remain closed. And yet, he knew. His pulse thundered as he forced the latch with a tool he had concealed. The door groaned open, releasing a draft of air that smelled faintly of sweat, ink, and something older, the scent of lives reduced to records. Inside, his candlelight flickered across a desk cluttered with ledgers. These weren't ordinary books of trade. They were personal accounts, written in the mistress's hand, notations of dates, names, and chillingly intimate details catalogued alongside sale prices. Each man was reduced to an entry, a line in a twisted diary of power and disposal. But the most damning evidence wasn't the ledgers. It was the items kept alongside them. Scraps of clothing, tokens taken from the enslaved, keepsakes preserved as if trophies. He froze, realizing the enormity of what he had found. This was no rumor. This was a system, deliberate, and says, bold, a ritual of domination documented in ink and flesh. In that moment, terror mixed with vindication. He had proof. But the floorboards creaked behind him, and he knew someone else was awake. The creak of the floorboard froze him in place. His candle trembled in his grip, shadows leaping like accusing fingers across the walls of that forbidden chamber. Slowly, he turned, heart hammering against his ribs. In the doorway stood the overseer, his broad figure silhouetted by the faint glow of the hallway lamp. For a long, suffocating moment, neither man spoke. Then, with a voice low and cold, the overseer said only one word, "Leave." But his eyes betrayed something darker, the recognition that the stranger had seen too much. Our hero snuffed the candle and lunged past him, adrenaline exploding through his veins. The hallways of the plantation house became a labyrinth of echoing footsteps, every corner a potential trap. He barreled down the staircase, the sound of pursuit close behind, boots pounding, voices rising, orders barked into the night. He burst through the front door, the humid air hitting him like a wave. The moon hung high, veiled by clouds, offering only faint light to guide his escape. Behind him, dogs barked, straining against their chains. A whistle cut the air, sharp as a blade, and the overseer shouted for men to give chase. He sprinted toward the stables, knowing the ledger's clutch to his chest would be worthless if he didn't survive the night. Hooves thundered as riders gave pursuit, their torches blazing against the darkness. The plantation grounds, so deceptively serene by day, now pulsed with danger. He cut through the fields, the sharp stalks slashing at his arms, the soil sucking at his boots. The cries behind him grew louder. They were gaining. His lungs burned, but he pushed harder, driven not only by fear, but by a grim determination. The truth he carried was too important to die with him. A fence loomed ahead, and with a desperate leap, he cleared it, tumbling into the brush beyond. The forest swallowed him, branches clawing at houghs. His clothes, the night alive with pursuit. For hours, the chase continued, flashes of torchlight weaving through the trees, dogs baying, voices cursing the darkness. Every breath became a prayer, every step a gamble, and still he clutched the evidence, refusing to let it slip from his grasp. By dawn, exhausted and bleeding, he found himself at the edge of the forest, civilization faintly visible beyond. He had escaped, but only just, and he knew this was far from over. By the time he stumbled into the nearest town, the sun had clawed its way above the horizon, bleeding orange light across the dusty main road. His body was ragged with exhaustion, his clothes torn from brambles, his skin streaked with blood and sweat. But in his arms, clutched as though his very life depended on it, were the ledgers and trinkets he had pulled from the mistress's secret chamber. Proof, tangible, undeniable proof. Each step toward the sheriff's office felt like a victory, like he was dragging the truth itself into daylight. He believed, foolishly perhaps, that once presented, no one could ignore what he carried. But civilization does not always welcome truth. When he burst through the doors, gasping, demanding attention, the room fell silent. Men looked up from their desks, their poker games, their idle gossip. He spilled the ledgers across the sheriff's desk, pointing to names, dates, and prices, his voice shaking with urgency. At first, the sheriff listened, brows furrowed, as he skimmed the meticulous handwriting. For a flicker of a moment, it seemed the tide might turn. But then came the questions, soft at first, then sharper. Where did you get these? What business do you have prying into a lady's affairs? Who exactly are you? The reversal was swift and brutal. His disguise as a traitor had worn thin, and suspicion clouded the room. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, the weight of social order pressing down heavier than any evidence could lift. This was, after all, a community built on loyalty. Loyalty to its image, its wealth, its silence. A respected plantation mistress accused of such unspeakable things? No. Easier to discredit the stranger, easier to label him a liar, a thief, an agitator sent to stir trouble. He argued, pleaded, pointed to the trophies and notes as proof, but each word fell into the abyss of willful ignorance. Men muttered about abolitionist lies. Women gasped about defaming a lady, and whispers of violence began to stir. The sheriff closed the ledger with a decisive thud, his jaw set, his decision already made. The truth, vivid, undeniable, was locked away in his desk drawer, dismissed as slander. And our hero, he was warned, in a tone dripping with menace, to leave town before sundown if he valued his life. Can you feel the crushing weight of that moment? He had risked everything, carried truth through blood and fire, only to find civilization itself a wall higher than the plantation's fences. That is the cruelty of history. Sometimes the truth arrives too early, and society is not yet willing to see. It took months before anything stirred again. The ledgers tucked away in the sheriff's desk gathered dust, but whispers do not stay buried forever. A visiting official from Savannah, pressed by abolitionist agitation and local disputes, demanded a surprise inspection of several plantations, including hers. She greeted them as she always did, poised, elegant, with a smile that could disarm suspicion. Yet, beneath that veneer, she knew the walls were closing in. When the inspectors insisted on touring the big house, her composure cracked, if only for a flicker of a second. They pushed past her protests, through the polished parlor, up the creaking staircase, and toward the iron-banded door she had always kept locked. The overseer fumbled with excuses, muttering about storage, about privacy, but the officials demanded entry, and when the lock was forced, what they found inside stripped the air from their lungs. The chamber was no ordinary room. The ledgers lay stacked neatly, rows of names recorded with chilling precision, a paper trail of human lives consumed and discarded. But it wasn't the ink that made men recoil. It was the relics, articles of clothing folded like trophies, scraps of fabric stained and worn, small possessions once belonging to enslaved men who had long since vanished. Some were etched with initials, others carried faint marks of use, reminders that these were not objects, but fragments of stolen humanity. The room smelled of stale sweat, ink, and decay, as though the very walls had absorbed the misery that took place within. Inspectors, hardened by years of witnessing the brutal machinery of slavery, stood silent, shaken. This was not labor. This was obsession. This was violation so profound it twisted the very definition of power. And yet, as their eyes adjusted, they realized the horror extended beyond records and relics. Carvings on the desk, initials scored into wood, hinted at men forced to leave their marks, unwilling participants in a ritual of control. That room became infamous in whispers long after. They called it the chamber, though no official report ever recorded its true contents. Documents vanished. Notes were sanitized. But for those present, the memory never faded. And in that silence, we glimpsed the greatest horror of all. The truth was uncovered, undeniable, yet swiftly smothered. The chamber of horrors was real, but the world chose to look away. The day the mistress's mask slipped was not marked by a confession, nor by public outrage, but by the stunned silence of those who had once praised her name. When word of the chamber spread, neighbors who had dined at her table, shared pews with her on Sundays, and entrusted their children to her hospitality, could no longer reconcile the image they had adored with the evidence uncovered. For years, she had cultivated perfection, the polished smile, the genteel accent, the reputation of a woman both graceful and charitable. But the room upstairs told a different story, one of obsession, cruelty, and exploitation carried out not in desperation, but in ritual. And she was not alone. The overseer, her right hand, emerged as a villain in his own right. His records, his silence, his complicity made him as guilty as the mistress herself. Whispers grew that he had participated, that his loyalty was not merely bought, but shared in twisted satisfaction. Even if he never laid a hand upon the victims, his willingness to guard her secret made him an architect of the system. Together, they were a partnership of shadows, one cloaked in wealth and femininity, the other in brute authority, bound by their shared investment in silence. Now, you have to understand how shocking this revelation was to the community. Southern society was built upon the myth of white female purity, The notion that women of her class were paragons of virtue to be protected at all costs. To expose her crimes was to expose the fragility of that myth. And so, while the overseer was quickly vilified, painted as the sole mastermind by those eager to salvage her reputation, the truth lingered like smoke. She had orchestrated, directed, and thrived on these acts. Behind every denial, behind every "surely not a lady," stood the unshakable evidence of her own handwriting. Yet, in the official record, her name faded into the background. Newspapers spoke vaguely of improprieties and disturbances, without daring to print the full horror. In private, however, those who had seen the chamber never forgot. Her eyes, once admired for their charm, were remembered only as cold, predatory. The overseer, stripped of his role, vanished under a cloud of suspicion, likely fleeing to another county. And she? She retreated into seclusion, her empire reduced, but never fully dismantled. That's the cruel paradox. Villains of her stature are rarely brought to justice. They are unmasked, yes, but too often shielded by the very structures that once empowered them. And that, my friend, may be the most chilling truth of all. You might think, after hearing the story of one plantation, that the horror began and ended with her. But I want you to picture this. The ledgers discovered in that locked chamber didn't just document men sold locally. They carried notes of transfers, buyers, and destinations stretching far beyond Georgia's borders. There were names of traders in Charleston, signatures from New Orleans, and even coded references suggesting links to ships bound for the Caribbean. This was not the story of one woman's cruelty in isolation. It was a glimpse into the machinery of an international system that thrived on bodies and silence. Now you have to understand, slavery was never simply local commerce. It was an empire, greased by wealth, politics, and an unspoken agreement to look the other way. The plantation mistress was a cog, yes, but a privileged one who manipulated the system for her own twisted rituals. And yet, when her victims were sold, they disappeared into a larger network, where records became vague, names were changed, and lives vanished without trace. To uncover her crimes was to brush up against something larger, a conspiracy of wealth that stretched across oceans. Inspectors who dared whisper about those links found themselves silenced quickly. Some said the ledgers hinted at buyers in Havana, Kingston, even London, ports where the slave trade had been abolished in name, but continued in shadow through loopholes and smuggling. Could it be true? Could the tokens of men she destroyed have traveled with their bodies into foreign markets, fueling a trade the world pretended had ended? The implications were staggering. Let's be real. What terrifies people most is not the idea of one villainous figure, but the realization that entire systems allow, even encourage, such horrors to flourish. The plantation mistress may have orchestrated her own private nightmare, but she thrived because the world provided her with buyers, ships, and bankers willing to profit from every sale. And in that silence, in that complicity, the true scope of the crime becomes clear. This was not just one plantation in Georgia, 1840. This was a thread in a vast blood-soaked web stretching across nations. Now you have to understand. The greatest crimes of history are not buried by accident. They are buried because people choose silence. In Georgia, 1840, the plantation mistress's secret chamber should have shaken the foundation of the community. It should have ignited outrage, shame, and justice. Instead, it was smothered. Town officials sealed reports, neighbors whispered in private but smiled in public, and church leaders prayed for harmony rather than truth. To admit what she had done was to admit that their entire system was corrupt, that the genteel facade of Southern respectability was nothing more than rot dressed in lace. I want you to picture this. Sermons that spoke vaguely of sin without naming it, newspapers that reduced atrocity to a dispute, families who forbade their children from asking questions. Those who tried to speak out were branded troublemakers. Their reputations ruined, their livelihoods destroyed. It wasn't simply fear of scandal, it was survival. The plantation economy fed the community. To expose her was to expose them all. Let's be real, silence is the most powerful accomplice of evil. The mistress was never dragged into court. The overseer vanished, perhaps punished, perhaps protected. The enslaved men, the true victims, were erased from public memory as if their suffering had never happened. And the chamber, locked, cleaned, and eventually forgotten, or rather, forced into forgetting. The story became rumor, rumor became myth, and myth became silence. But silence leaves echoes. Generations later, descendants would stumble across fragments, a name in a ledger, a hushed family story, a scar passed down in memory, and in those echoes, the truth refuses to die. The end of the story, if we can even call it that, is not neat. The mistress, once the center of power, retreated into the shadows of her estate. She was never formally punished. Some say she lived out her days in quiet paranoia, haunted by the knowledge that her secret had been glimpsed and almost exposed. Others whisper that she maintained her influence, manipulating neighbors and relatives to preserve the illusion of propriety. She became a ghost of her former self, feared, respected, and untouchable in equal measure. The overseer, her accomplice in silence, disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. No records indicate where he went, though rumors suggest he fled to a neighboring county, assuming a new identity, forever haunted by the ledger he helped create. Some say he spent his later years in bitterness, a shadow of the man who once held absolute power over men's lives. And the hero? He survived, though not unscathed. The ordeal left him scarred by exhaustion, betrayal, and the realization that truth alone does not guarantee justice. He carried the evidence, documented the chamber, and recorded what he could. But in the end, his warnings fell on deaf ears, dismissed by society too invested in preserving its own myths. Yet, despite the disbelief, he persisted. He became a chronicler, a witness to crimes that few wanted remembered. In a sense, his fate was both burden and honor. The truth could live because he refused to let it die. The enslaved men, the true victims, remained almost entirely erased. Their lives, broken and dispersed, were seldom recorded beyond the faintest traces in the ledgers. Some survived, finding refuge in distant plantations or towns, carrying the scars of power, fear, and forced submission. Their stories were muted, fragments whispered into the ears of the few willing to listen. In the silence left behind, their suffering became both evidence and warning. A reminder that power unchecked can corrupt, and that injustice thrives when silence is chosen over truth. History is rarely kind to those who uncover its darkest corners, and this story is no exception. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and refinement, has long since crumbled, its fields overtaken by weeds, its walls surrendered to time. Yet the legacy of what occurred within remains, etched into the memories of those who survived and whispered across generations like a warning. The mistress's power, the overseer's complicity, the silence of the community, all form a mirror of human nature. When ambition, desire, and fear collide, we are reminded that evil often wears refinement and charm, and that cruelty can thrive under the guise of propriety. I want you to picture this. A ledger, half-decayed, rediscovered decades later in an attic, revealing not just names and numbers, but lives stolen, identities erased, and the careful orchestration of suffering. It is a haunting record of the lengths humans will go to protect themselves, their status, and their illusions. And it serves as a moral warning. Unchecked power, when cloaked in societal approval, can inflict harm far beyond what we imagine. Silence and complicity, even in the face of atrocity, allow corruption to grow roots that entwine with history itself. Let's be real. The story of this plantation is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a reflection of patterns that repeat when vigilance fades and conscience is deferred. It asks difficult questions. How many secrets lie hidden in places we consider safe? How many abuses are smoothed over by polite society, only to echo through generations? And perhaps, most unsettling of all, could it happen again? The echoes of the past are never fully silent. They linger, waiting for those brave enough to hear and those wise enough to learn. In the end, the legacy is both a caution and a challenge. To remember, to question, and to bear witness is not merely a duty. It is an act of courage. And if we fail to do so, the mistakes of the past are doomed to repeat, cloaked in silence once more. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? History teaches us that power, secrecy, and silence are universal, timeless forces. The plantation mistress's chamber may have been locked, the ledgers destroyed, and the whispers nearly forgotten, but the echoes remain. And if we fail to notice the signs, if we ignore the stories that unsettle us, the cycle begins again. Now, I want you to think about your own surroundings. How many injustices slip through unnoticed? How many truths are hidden behind polite smiles, polished facades, and carefully curated reputations? This is why we gather here, on Echoes of Truth, to listen, to question, and to witness what history tried to bury. We explore the shadows, not for shock alone, but so that knowledge becomes a shield and awareness becomes a weapon against repetition. If you followed this journey to its unsettling conclusion, I challenge you to engage, subscribe, leave a comment with your location, share the story, and join a growing community determined to confront history's darkest secrets. Because confronting the past is the first step toward preventing the horrors of the future. And as for what comes next, there are stories that stretch even further, where corruption, obsession, and betrayal intersect in places you would never imagine. The next chapter is waiting, lurking in the corners of history, ready to challenge everything you thought you knew. Keep your curiosity sharp and your courage closer, because what we uncover next may haunt you long after the screen goes dark.